Thank you, Ben. We started a series last week on the Ten Commandments, and this morning we get to that very first command. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. I'm sure you've had a piece of technology that you were kind of getting tired of because it wasn't working the way you wanted it to, and then someone comes along and just goes beep, boop, 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 and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, this was so simple. I had it in my hands this whole time. I didn't understand the significance of what I had. It's like when I had my guitar. I bought it after a few years of playing, and when I would look at reviews online, they would sound so much better from other people. The guitar would sound so much better. A friend of mine was a really good guitarist down in South Africa, and he even recorded songs. He asked me to borrow my guitar for a recording he did. And I'm thinking, wow, just when I thought I needed to get a better guitar, the problem was me. There's actually so much more to this instrument than what I was even using it for. We only see God's law often like this, in one dimension, thinking how good could it really be? How far can this really take us? These simple, bland 10 words from Exodus chapter 20. But as we saw last week in the introductory sermon, God's law is three-dimensional. There's much more to it than just calling us to a particular duty. It also has a purpose that it's directing us towards, a good intent and a goal that all of these commands are driving us and all of society toward. And on top of that, the third dimension is character. Within ourselves, new virtue is cultivated when we walk according to God's ways. We see purpose, duty, and character working together in a three-dimensional pattern to actually show us the beauty of God's law when we thought it was ancient, outdated, and irrelevant for us today. So in looking at the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, what is the duty that this command calls us to? What is the purpose that it directs us toward? And what kind of character and virtue would reshape our life if we were to walk according to its good design? So first, the duty of this command. The Lord said, you shall have no other gods before me. What does it mean to have a God? We don't necessarily think in those terms today. What would it mean to have a God so that we can make sure we don't have one of those besides the one true God? Well, in Exodus chapter 20, we are perhaps at the final summit of this account. At Mount Sinai, when God gives the law to his people. Previously, God had delivered them through the Red Sea. That was another big summit of this account. And before that, probably the first summit of this account, of this narrative, this high point, are the 10 plagues that God brought down on Egypt. And it is in these 10 plagues that we learn something about what it means to have other gods. Because in these 10 plagues, God was demonstrating his own power and also his own power over every other god that the Egyptians were worshiping. They worshiped many gods, as did every ancient culture we know of. Because they believed that a god was only a god over a particular aspect of life. So you need as many as you could get. You needed a god over the sun. You needed a god for fertility if you're a woman trying to get pregnant and struggling with that. You needed a god over life. You needed a god over water. Whatever kind of aspect of life that you dealt with, you probably had a god for. In fact, we have ancient manuscripts we can see today that gives us directions on how to pray towards certain gods in Egyptian ingredients to put together as an incantation I read to protect your sleeping child at night. They had a god for everything that you could shake a stick at. And it is in this context the Lord is saying, have no other gods besides me. There should be no other gods that you seek ultimate provision from and protection. There should be no other gods that you devote your life to serving. Because these Egyptian gods were indeed false gods, as proven by the 10 plagues, we could state this command another way. Do not rely on things that can't actually save you. Don't place your hope and trust in anything to do for you what only God can do. Don't place your hope in anything to be for you what only God can be. There is no other source of life or power or provision which can match what God can provide and what God can do. Nor is there any other source of life or power or provision which can meet the deepest needs of our hearts, which we long for. Notice, unlike the gods of Egypt, the Lord didn't limit himself or particularize his sphere of life that he reigns over. He didn't say, have no other sun god but me, or have no other fertility god but me, but rather have no other gods, period. Full stop. Because the Lord God is God over all. Each of the 10 plagues the Lord brought down against Egypt uniquely taunted their gods and showed him to be the most powerful God. Yet, when God commands the Israelites to have no other God before him, he is placing himself, in effect, as their exclusive provider of every aspect of life. The Lord was claiming to be God over everything, and if this were true, then of course you should only worship this God. But a quick question before we keep moving. Does God really have a right to demand this kind of exclusive worship and devotion that he does in the first commandment? This might not be an objection that you think of, but it'll certainly be an objection that our world thinks of when they hear these kinds of claims from Scripture. Does God have a right to demand this kind of exclusive worship? God is right in saying this because it's true. God deserves the very worship and devotion of our lives. And I assure you, God is not being a narcissist for requiring the exclusive worship of our life any more than you as a parent would be a narcissist for requiring obedience and respect from your children. As a child driving or riding in the backseat home from church one day, we didn't probably get a mile from church until my mother pulled over on the side of the road because she had just had it with our bickering in the back seat. Shortly after we pulled aside, Mr. DiPilato from church pulled in right behind us because he noticed our car. And he comes to the side of the window. My mother rolls the window down. He can just see what's going on. He had 5 kids of his own. And without needing to know what the issue was, what the argument at hand was being debated, or what my mother was saying, he didn't need to know any of those details in order to point his finger and said, children, you ought and must respect your mother. You need to listen to your mother. And then he drove off. And that was that. As simple as that. The particular circumstance was irrelevant. Why? What would you say to a child who is baffled at the thought and asks, why must I just obey and respect my mother? You would probably say something like this: she deserves your respect. You are, in fact, in her debt, and this is what you owe her. She has more than earned it. You wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for your mother. And even after she gave birth to you, she watched over you very carefully, saving you from 1,000 more deaths you would have had otherwise. Not to mention all the unnecessary things your mother does for you, like pursue your joy, like break her own bedtime rules so that you could stay up and watch a movie and have extra dessert. Why must I obey and respect my parents? Our duty to this is self-evident, and only a wicked or foolish child would ever think to ask such a thing. Yet for God, it is all the more self-evident and all the more sinful for violating this command to worship him alone. For God provided us so much more than even our mothers. He has given us, as the Apostle Paul says in Acts 17, our life and our breath and our everything. And he could have included, and your mothers too. God gave you the mothers that you had. Is not God do the worship of our life? What other duty could a creature have but to seek the only one who could provide these ultimate needs and live for us and live a life to glorify him, the one who's benevolently given us everything that we have? God is God over all, and he is due the exclusive worship and devotion of our life. Everything else we might look to is a mere creature of this creator, something that God has made. Why not look to the God who is over all, who made all things? Why not seek ultimate provision and protection from him alone? Why worship a false god? Some fashion of something that the true God himself made. Why live according to another word? Why pursue the promise of someone else? God is due our worship, and he alone has the power to save us from life's greatest troubles. And just seeing how self-evident this is, how all-encompassing this command is over every aspect of life, we clearly see the 1,000 variations of violating this command that we have each carried out in our life, despite how self-evident this duty is. We see at once our sinful condition, our state of existence, the foolishness of our hearts, habitually seeking after other things God has made to provide for us, things that only God can provide. If a child ought to be punished for disrespecting his mother, who has given him so much, what should come of us creatures who have hardened ourselves against our benevolent Creator? We have all, whether arrogantly or ignorantly, violated God's law and thus have sealed our fate. Therefore, before we ever can begin to enjoy the purpose for which God has instilled this particular command, we need to be reconciled to him. We need to be redeemed from him, from the penalty of our own sin. Now, at this point, we go back to ancient Egypt again, creating rituals and incantations to spur up God to hear our prayers. What might we do to turn God's face toward us and win his favor? Again, the first commandment really helps us. Ironically, it leaves us no choice even in this. We not only need to look to God as the ultimate provider and protector of our lives, but also the redeemer of our souls, excluding even our own efforts from the saving formula. The one true God doesn't act like the gods of our imagination. He doesn't meet us halfway after we've done all we can do. He comes to us. He rescues us in our place before we've lifted a finger, while we were walking in the rebellion of our sin, as Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Ephesians chapter 2, while we were walking dead in sin, God made us alive in Christ. Jesus Christ perfectly obeyed this commandment, unlike every other human being who ever existed. And he obeyed this commandment perfectly in order to redeem us. For Jesus' death on the cross was not just payment for the penalty of our sin, but his life served as the obedient account that we needed to stand before God, the righteousness that we did not have in our own effort. Jesus perfectly relied upon God and worshiped him alone, even before the cross, praying things like, "Not my will be done, but yours be done." He was tempted by Satan. "If you would just worship me, Jesus, you can have all the kingdoms of the world which I am over." But Jesus knew the first commandment. He walked by it and drove towards its purpose, knowing to only worship God alone and not give up any worship to any other thing that God has made. Because Jesus knew God as Lord over all, he knew that Satan was just a puppet. He was just temporarily in charge of these nations, and that God would be the ultimate decider of who reigned, when, and where. Our effort and works will never be enough to cover our sin, neither will the good works that we perform in our life. And so we need this double cure of Jesus. death on our behalf to pay for our sin, and a righteous life to be credited to our account. And it is only now, in this position, covered in Christ, united to him by faith alone, that we can commune with God, that we can enjoy life for what it is. Otherwise, we would always have the guilt of our failure and the inadequacy of our own works hanging over us, no matter how hard we tried to please God and obey these commandments. But in Christ, the righteous requirement of the law has been met. Now we can walk in God's way without fear of condemnation. Now we can actually enjoy life the way God has designed it and see the beauty of the purposes for his commands. So what is this intended goal? What is the purpose of the first commandment? Where is it directing our lives? When we fashion false gods out of things that God has made, we not only A, forsake the only true God who can redeem us, but B, we are unable to enjoy the things God has made because we've made them into something that they were not. We turn many things God has made for us to enjoy into sacred cows. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase sacred cow before, how it refers to certain Hindu people in India who would starve to death before they killed a cow around them, believing cows were sacred. But did you know this belief of theirs actually evolved over time? They did not always believe this in their history. Dr. Marvin Harris, an anthropologist from Columbia University, he documented this when this was becoming public news in the 60s and 70s about Hindu people starving to death because of the monsoon damage. He actually points out Hindu beliefs actually allowed for killing of cattle for celebratory feasts, the earliest ancient documents that we have of what they believed. He writes, in time they would only limit the killing of cattle to these feasts because of how valuable their cattle were for the rest of their agricultural economy. Their cattle plowed fields, produced milk, and provided dung to fertilize the fields for gardening and fuel for fire. They wouldn't be able to afford the coal to fuel the fires that they needed if they killed their cattle. Killing a cattle for its beef meant eliminating these other precious resources and services that it provided. And so they brought provisions in to limit their killing of cattle. But over time, it became a religious ban. Eating beef, he writes, arose to prevent the population from consuming the animal in which the Indian agriculture depends, but it later became codified by the priesthood, and the cow became sacred. It began as a wise limitation, but grew with greater intensity to become a foolish ritual that had the watching world dumbfounded as certain Hindu people in the 60s and 70s let their people starve to death as fat cattle roamed in the background. An original good purpose was gradually reshaped over time and was unwittingly given divine qualities which only belonged to God. And we see how that just leaves us wanting. It leaves our souls wanting when we take things God has made and put into them or look to them with divine, as if they have divine or sacred qualities. As creator, God designed all of life with a particular purpose. He designed it all to work together in harmonious unity, to produce joy in the flourishing of people and all society together. This is the picture that we are seeing painted for us in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. But when we go to something God has made and look for it to be for us and do for us what only God could be or do, we will always fail and only find disappointments. Because created things make terrible gods, and it leaves its worshipers always wanting. Only when we worship God for who he is can we enjoy life for what it is. We've seen how the phrase no other gods means that God is over all. But this second phrase, have no other gods before me, brings us deeper into the significance of the first commandment. The phrase before me is elsewhere translated in my presence, or most literally before my face. Though the simplest translation is not always correct or best, most commentators think it is in this case. Consider again the cultural background of Egypt and Israel in the ancient Near East. There were many gods to call out to and consult, depending on what your situation was. Each had their designation over various aspects of life. But when we seek God's face, we must not bring any other gods with us to consult. There ought to be no other gods that we allow in his presence, in the presence of the one true God, when it comes to divine consultations. And why? We've already seen one reason, because the Lord is the only true God. Only he can save and redeem us in any ultimate sense. But now a second reason, because we will miss out on the good purpose for which he made the thing we're trying to worship. Rather than enjoying the things God has made according to their purpose for our life, we take these things and gradually fashion them into gods. And this creates two problems with one act. On the one hand, we have fashioned a God which cannot save us. And on the other hand, we lose out on the actual goodness that God had for that thing. We create new kinds of sacred cows and starve to death as a result. Let me offer just a couple examples of how we might do that. First, on a corporate or social level as a society. We so easily do this with politics and government. Government authority becomes a sacred cow for us when we look for it to liberate us in an ultimate sense, as if it could liberate us from the curse and corruption of sin. We see things like racism, poverty, crime, healthcare, and we look to our fashioned gods of politics as if they could bring ultimate deliverance to any of these things. Our government structure starts out as something we think of as nice, an official way to relate to other nations and govern our own societies and lead us to justice and joy. But as time goes on, we start to get a little antsy, don't we? The more we learn about the ins and outs of policy, law, criminal justice, and taxes, the more vain all of it seems. Then a candidate rises up we think will set everything right again. But what happens? The progress that we hope to see falls far short of what we were hoping. Every time. Perhaps they just need a second term. Our perspective on politics and government will always lead us to despair if we make it into a sacred cow, if we infuse in it qualities and attributes which only belong to God. Now, we as human beings have a God-given calling to govern the societies of our world with integrity and justice. Therefore, it is our duty to do our best. And there are many legitimate problems that we can point out with our elected officials and the policies for which they govern with. But when we endow politics with divine attributes in our minds by looking to them to bring some sort of ultimate deliverance, we will always be led to disappointment and despair. And you know, a politician has made themselves a sacred cow in a way by talking in ultimate, eternal, utopian ways, saying things like, we are going to end racism, or we are going to eliminate poverty, or we will discover the cure for every disease. We just need this, or that. And surely this will never happen again. This will be eradicated from, the human heart? Who do you think you are? Now let's seek progress in every one of those areas, but let's get one thing straight. What is the actual purpose that God has given us for politics and governing societies? It's not to redeem creation, but to sustain it, to preserve it, to hold it up from spiraling out from the curse of sin. This is what we see in Genesis 9 with God's covenant to Noah, establishing human governments. There is a reason Jesus taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. It's because God's will cannot be perfectly and forever ultimately established until heaven breaks into earth. Not when we build up earth to reach heaven. Does that sound familiar? That's the Tower of Babel. Let's not go back with those views. If we didn't endow, and think about the flip side, if we didn't endow politics or government with divine qualities and make them sacred cows in our own way, perhaps we wouldn't be hoping for them to bring about a heavenly existence on earth, and then maybe we could actually appreciate what our governing authorities have done. And even see our political opponents as also fulfilling the calling of God's common grace over all of life, despite the difference of opinions we might have on more technical details. If we don't fashion created things into gods, we can benefit and appreciate how God actually intended them to be used in society, in our life. We can enjoy them for what they are and not be disappointed for what they're not. The people, if anyone, the people who know their God, the church, we should be able to tell the difference between these things. Now, how about one more personal example on an individual level? It's very easy to talk about money and how we make this a sacred cow in our life. When we first get money, when we first start making money, perhaps as a teenager, we are blown away. We don't have any bills. We can put this right into the mall. I remember driving as a young Marine on base late at night. I was coming back from hanging out with friends or something, and I drove by a gas station. And I thought, what am I doing? Why am I not pulling in here right now and buying Reese's? There's no rules anymore. I'm an adult. I've made money. And this is what we're thinking. We can just pursue all that comes to our mind. But as we get older, things change. Bills start coming up. We start learning how we need to be responsible, think about the future, organize ourselves a little bit. And then the sacred cow starts being fashioned little by little. If I just had a little bit more. But our taste buds grow with our salary and sometimes beyond our salary. We see other people that have more than we do, and we think, man, their life seems to be totally put together. Perhaps this is the solution I need. That's how money starts to become a sacred cow. We start to look to it to provide for the ultimate needs of our life and infuse into it divine responsibilities to relieve our stress, to heal our family relationships, to restore our aching or aging bodies, to bring our lives to a state of unending happiness and joy. If I just had enough, maybe I could accomplish one of these goals. But if we didn't fashion money into a type of God, then maybe we could actually enjoy it for the gift that it is, as a resource to provide for our needs and to love our neighbor. Maybe then we would be more willing to give and bless others rather than hoarding it for ourselves. Perhaps we'd be more willing to invest in something that's going to outlive us. Now, as I've proposed, idolatry can include more things than merely bowing down to an idol or bringing an offering to the shrine of a god. And that's because this is how the Apostle Paul talks about it in the New Testament on numerous occasions. And you know, there's nothing in the New Testament that is called idolatry more than greed. In Ephesians chapter 5 and Colossians chapter 3, he calls idolatry greed. And he calls greedy people idolaters. Why? Was there an idol they were going to? Not a physical one. In what way is greed idolatry? Well, Jesus himself explains in Matthew chapter 6 and Luke 16. Because just as no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one or despise the other, so no one can serve God and money. Either our souls will rest in God alone, or they will be groping in the dark, searching for something else to satisfy us, greedy towards others who, from our perspective, have what we're looking for. If something like greed can be called idolatry, then what quality, character, or virtue would be considered true worship? Greed is on the one hand called idolatry. What would be called true worship? Contentment, rest, confidence, peace. These are the types of qualities that would shape us if we would walk in alignment with the purpose of the first commandment. I think it's funny, when people die, we say they can now rest in peace. Because that's how frustrating life is. You know how frustrating the rat race of life is when we say of people who've died, they can now rest in peace. The psalmist has a different approach, though. Look again at Psalm 62, verse 1. I am at rest in God alone. Why? For my salvation comes from him. Verse 5. Rest in God alone, my soul. Why? For my hope comes from him. What are you hoping for today? Is there an ultimate hope you have which you think, if I had it, then my soul could rest? Therefore, we need to vote this way this election cycle. Or, therefore, if I just had this salary, or if I just had these kinds of relationships, what are you hoping for in an ultimate sense? Verse 6, God alone, not God plus my preferred politics, not God plus my ideal relationships, not God plus my dream salary. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I will not be shaken. My salvation and glory depend on God. Do you want to be glorified? What are you seeking for? Depend on God, and you will be glorified in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. My refuge is in God. When we fashion false gods out of things God has made, we not only, A, forsake the only true God who can redeem us, but B, we are unable to enjoy those things according to God's good design. But when we worship God alone, our souls can find rest. They can find the rest that we've been searching for. And then we can turn and enjoy life for what it is. In a way, we who have been reconciled to God through Jesus Christ can rest in peace. For we have died to the world and her gods as we live for God's glory. Let's take a moment now and respond to God in prayer. So something the sermon made you think about that you need to pray about. This is just an unrushed moment for you to quiet yourself before the Lord. Give back to him what you've been wrestling with in your head. Fall again on his grace. Look again to Christ as your only way to be brought into his good favor and be directed toward his good purposes for life.